In 1947, Miles Davis heard about an unknown white arranger living in a basement apartment who was creating revolutionary music that no record label would touch. When Miles knocked on Gil Evans's door, he discovered a musical genius working in complete obscurity. What happened in that basement over the next 3 years changed jazz history and created one of music's most important partnerships. It was September 1947, and 21-year-old Miles Davis was struggling to find his voice in the rapidly evolving New York jazz scene. The bebop revolution led by Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie was in full swing, but Miles felt constrained by its limitations. He wanted to create something different, something that combined the harmonic sophistication of bebop with a cooler, more orchestral sound that no one had figured out how to achieve. Miles had heard whispers in the jazz clubs about a mysterious arranger who was working with sounds that defied classification. Musicians would mention him in passing. There's this cat Gil Evans, who's doing something completely different, but no one seemed to know much about him. He wasn't signed to any major label, he didn't have famous musicians playing his arrangements, and he certainly wasn't making any money from his music. What Miles discovered was that Gil Evans was living in a basement apartment at 55 West 55th Street, in a space so small and cramped that most people would have considered it uninhabitable. But for Gil, it was a laboratory where he was conducting the most advanced musical experiments of his generation. Gil Evans was 25 years old in 1947, but he had been thinking about orchestral jazz for nearly a decade. Born in Canada and raised in California, Gil had developed his musical ideas in relative isolation, away from the traditional jazz centers of New York and Chicago. This isolation had allowed him to think differently about what jazz could be, unencumbered by the conventional wisdom that dominated the scene. While other arrangers were focused on making jazz swing harder or sound more complex, Gil was interested in making it sound more colorful, more textured, more emotionally sophisticated. He was influenced by classical composers like Ravel and Debussy, and he was fascinated by the possibility of applying their harmonic concepts to jazz improvisation. But Gil's revolutionary ideas meant nothing if no one was willing to listen to them, let alone record them. In 1947, the record industry was conservative and risk-averse. Label executives wanted proven formulas, established stars, and music that would appeal to existing audiences. Gil's orchestral jazz concepts were too experimental, too expensive to produce, and too far outside the mainstream to interest commercial producers. So Gil worked in his basement, writing arrangements that he hoped someday someone would hear and understand. The person who told Miles about Gil Evans was Jerry Mulligan, a young baritone saxophone player who had stumbled upon Gil's apartment earlier that year. Gary had been amazed by what he heard: odd arrangements that were unlike anything being played in the clubs, music that was both intellectually sophisticated and emotionally moving. "Miles," Jerry said one evening at a club on 52nd Street, "you need to meet this arranger. He's doing things with harmony and orchestration that I've never heard before. It's like he's found a way to make jazz orchestras sound like chamber music." Miles was skeptical. He had met plenty of arrangers who promised revolutionary concepts, but delivered nothing more than rehashed swing band formulas. But something in Jerry's enthusiasm convinced him to make the trip to 55th Street. When Miles knocked on the door of Gil Evans's basement apartment on a Tuesday evening in September 1947, he had no idea that he was about to meet the person who would become his most important creative collaborator. Gil answered the door himself, a tall, thin man with intense eyes and a quiet demeanor that immediately impressed Miles. This wasn't the self-promoting hustler that Miles had expected to find. This was someone who was serious about music in a way that transcended commercial concerns. "You must be Miles," Gil said. "Jerry told me you might stop by. Come in." The apartment was unlike anything Miles had ever seen. Every surface was covered with sheet music, arrangements in various stages of completion, classical scores marked with Gil's notes and comments, sketches of harmonic ideas that looked more like mathematical equations than musical compositions. "I've been listening to your work with Charlie Parker," Gil said as he cleared a chair for Miles to sit down. "You have a sound that's different from the other bebop players, cooler, more introspective. I've been thinking about how that sound might work with larger arrangements." Miles looked around the apartment, taking in the organized chaos of Gil's creative process. This wasn't just someone who wrote arrangements for hire. This was someone who was conducting serious research into the possibilities of orchestral jazz. "Play me something," Miles said. Gil walked to an old upright piano and began playing one of his arrangements, singing the horn parts in a soft voice that somehow managed to convey the complex interweaving of different instrumental voices. What Miles heard was unlike anything he had experienced in jazz. The arrangement was harmonically sophisticated, with chord progressions that borrowed from classical music but maintained a jazz sensibility. But more than that, it was orchestrated in a way that gave each instrument a distinct voice while creating an overall sound that was both unified and complex. "How long have you been working on this?" Miles asked. "This particular piece? About 6 months. I write slowly because I'm trying to solve problems that haven't been solved before." Miles listened as Gil played several more arrangements, each one revealing new possibilities for what jazz orchestration could achieve. This wasn't just arranging this was composition at the highest level, with an understanding of harmony and orchestration that rivaled anything being done in classical music. "Who's recording this music?" Miles asked. Gil laughed, but there was no bitterness in it. "No one. Record labels hear orchestral jazz and they think either dance band music or symphony orchestra with a jazz soloist. They don't understand what I'm trying to do." "What are you trying to do?" Gil thought for a moment before answering. "I'm trying to create a new kind of ensemble music, something that has the harmonic sophistication of classical music, but maintains the improvisational spirit of jazz. Music that's arranged, but not rigid, sophisticated but not cold." Miles understood immediately. This was exactly what he had been looking for, a way to move beyond bebop without abandoning its innovations. "Would you be interested in working with a small group of musicians who understand what you're trying to do?" Miles asked. "You mean actually recording this music?" "I mean developing it, recording it, and finding a way to get it heard." Gil's eyes lit up with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. For years, he had been working in isolation, creating music that he hoped would someday find an audience. Now one of the most promising young musicians in jazz was offering to help make that happen. "What did you have in mind?" Gil asked. Miles explained his vision for a recording project that would bring together the most innovative young musicians in New York to explore Gil's orchestral concepts. It wouldn't be a big band in the traditional sense, and it wouldn't be a small combo either. It would be something new, a group large enough to achieve orchestral colors, but small enough to maintain the intimacy and flexibility of a jazz ensemble. Over the next 3 hours, Miles and Gil developed the concept that would become the birth of the Cool Sessions. They would assemble a 9-piece group, featuring trumpet, trombone, French horn, tuba, alto saxophone, baritone saxophone, piano, bass, and drums. The unusual instrumentation would allow for harmonic and textural possibilities that had never been explored in jazz. More importantly, they would approach the music differently than anyone had before. Instead of featuring a star soloist with orchestral accompaniment, they would create arrangements where the improvised solos were integrated into the overall orchestral concept. The soloist wouldn't be separate from the arrangement. They would be part of it. "The challenge," Gil explained, "is to create music that's complex enough to be intellectually satisfying but accessible enough to reach people emotionally. Too much complexity and you lose the audience. Too little and you're not advancing the art form." Miles understood exactly what Gil meant. This was the same balance he had been trying to achieve in his own playing music that was sophisticated without being cold, innovative without being alienating. As the evening progressed, Miles realized that he had found more than just an arranger. He had found a musical partner who understood his artistic vision better than he understood it himself. Gil could hear possibilities in Miles's trumpet sound that Miles hadn't even recognized, and he had the technical skills to realize those possibilities through orchestration. By the time Miles left Gil's apartment that night, they had laid the groundwork for a collaboration that would revolutionize jazz. But more than that, they had established a creative partnership based on mutual respect and shared artistic vision. The birth of the Cool Sessions began in earnest in early 1948. Miles assembled the musicians, including Jerry Mulligan, Lee Konitz, J.J. Johnson, and other young innovators who were eager to explore new musical territory. Gil provided the arrangements that would showcase each musician's strengths while creating an overall sound that was unlike anything in jazz. The rehearsals took place in Gil's basement apartment, with 9 musicians crammed into a space that could barely accommodate half that many. But the cramped conditions somehow enhanced the intimacy of the music they were creating. Everyone could hear everyone else clearly, and the close quarters forced them to listen carefully to how their individual parts fit into the larger orchestral concept. Gil's arrangements were unlike anything the musicians had played before. They required precise ensemble playing while still leaving room for improvisation. The harmonies were more complex than traditional jazz arrangements, but they were designed to enhance rather than obscure the melodic content. Gil's arrangements made us all sound better than we actually were, Lee Konitz would say years later. He had a way of writing parts that brought out the best in each musician while serving the overall musical concept. The first recording session took place in January 1949, but the music had been in development for over a year by that point. Capitol Records had agreed to record the group, though label executives weren't entirely sure what they were getting. The music was too sophisticated for the dance band market, but too jazz-oriented for the classical audience. What they got was some of the most innovative music ever recorded. The birth of the cool sessions created a new subgenre of jazz, Nia's cool jazz, that would influence musicians for decades. But more importantly, they proved that Gil Evans's orchestral concepts could work in practice, not just in theory. The collaboration between Miles and Gil continued for years, producing albums like Miles Ahead, Porgy and Bess, and Sketches of Spain that are now considered classics of orchestral jazz. But it all started in that basement apartment in 1947, when a young trumpet player knocked on the door of an unknown arranger and discovered a musical genius working in obscurity. Gil Evans never achieved the same level of fame as Miles Davis, but his influence on jazz orchestration was profound and lasting. He showed that jazz arrangements could be as sophisticated as classical composition while maintaining the spontaneity and emotional power that made jazz unique. The partnership between Miles and Gil proved that great music often comes from unexpected collaborations, from artists who recognize something special in each other and have the courage to explore new creative territory together. Their first meeting in that basement apartment changed not just their careers, but the entire trajectory of American music. Years later, Miles would say that meeting Gil Evans was one of the most important moments of his musical life. "Gil heard things in my playing that I didn't even know were there," Miles explained. He could take a simple melody and orchestrate it in ways that made it sound like something completely new, but still essentially itself. The birth of the Cool Sessions were recorded in 1949 and 1950. But their influence extended far beyond those specific recording dates. They established orchestral jazz as a legitimate artistic pursuit and inspired countless musicians to explore the possibilities of arranged jazz that maintained improvisational freedom. But perhaps most importantly, the collaboration between Miles Davis and Gil Evans showed that innovation in music comes from artists who are willing to take risks, experiment with new ideas, and work with people who challenge them to grow creatively. Today, The Birth of the Cool is recognized as one of the most important recordings in jazz history, but it might never have existed if Miles Davis hadn't decided to knock on the door of an unknown arranger living in a basement apartment, creating revolutionary music that no one else was willing to hear. The lesson of their partnership is clear. Sometimes the most important creative relationships begin with a simple act of curiosity. The willingness to seek out someone who's doing something different and see if you can learn from each other. If this incredible story of musical partnership and innovation inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the most important collaborations often begin with the courage to knock on an unknown door. Have you ever discovered someone whose work changed your perspective completely? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out more stories about the partnerships that changed music history.